Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Common Christianity. My name's Asher, and I am joined by my friends Aaron and Zach. And today we're basically going to be talking about like the church, basically since like the first two world wars up until about 2019. And so for a lot of us, if you are kind of, millennial, Gen Z, we're going to be covering a lot of our history, from the 80s forward. But then even if you're like a boomer and an Xer, we're going to be covering a lot of your history as well. So there's going to be different little parts of history and things like that. So really from like the 19th up until the last, basically, like, not the last 90 years, it's the last 90 years before the pandemic, essentially. And so that's going to be kind of fun. But before we get into all of that, how are we all doing tonight?
Doing well.
Doing pretty fine today.
Doing pretty fine. That's a new one. That's a new one from you, Aaron. Oh, that's good. As y'all might see, I'm in a new apartment. I moved out, and so those are fun digs. We could talk about that later, if at all. That's not really relevant, but
Nice, nice.
that's kind of the thing there. But yeah, and so I think that's how we're all doing. And then just to give you guys like a quick little run down for the season, we have this episode and the next one, and then we're done. And so then that'll be season 2, and we will have gotten through a lot of church history. So a lot of it, if not all of it, at least from like a 30,000-foot perspective, with a couple of dips to like ground level. And so, Zach, I want to throw it to you here real quick. If we had to start kind of this, you called this part church in the nuclear age, kind of this entire idea of, and the initial idea we had was sort of the evolution of end times theology was kind of going to be the main pitch for this one. But I'm just trying to think. It's like, in my quick research of this week for this episode, it seems like the big phenomena is the effect of post-traumatic stress of the two world wars on the general populace, how that expressed itself in the church, and the emergence of these, essentially, like the seeker sensitive movement, the new atheism, and megachurches that were outside of urban cores. Those are some of the bigger things that at least popped up in my view. But how would you set up this conversation based on what you would call responsible teaching of the last 90 years or so?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit some treetop levels pretty well there. The church in the nuclear age is a concept, from when I teach the class at my church, which is attempting to kind of help frame the church as it's dealing. You use the word, post traumatic stress. It's really coming to terms with a world in which, well, here's the nosedive. Here's where it gets deep, because it helps to understand that the world wars really had an effect upon the idea that we were getting better as
Hmm.
humans, right?
Yeah.
So for a while there, before the world wars, there was this, this thought in the mind of people that, hey, we're getting better, we're constantly getting better. Science is improving our lives, we're making these discoveries, we're getting further away from ignorance and towards tolerance and this maybe utopian idea, and you see some of that reflected in some of the cults and things like that. But when the world wars happened, it was an effective kind of kibosh on that whole idea, because
Yeah.
not only are you dealing with war on a scale that we've never seen before, I mean, this is worldwide in essence, right? But we're also dealing with technologies. Well, I mean, technology was one of those things that was going to save us. And yet now technology is being used to kill more people in a single swipe than ever before. So you put that into the consciences of people who are, trying to live their lives. And then maybe you gather those people up inside of a church. And obviously, those types of questions and those types of reactions to a world that has now become kind of scary,
Hmm.
we're going to have a certain way that we respond to that. Of course we will. And when I teach the class, I use that as an entree to help people then understand where just two quick things that happen. It affects the way that we think and it affects the growth of the church. On the thinking side, this is where we find postmodernism come in. This
Mm,
is a world where now we no longer believe that there's one absolute truth, but rather there's a more tribal understanding. You have your truth, I have my truth. There's no longer this single narrative that fits over the entire world, entire humanity. It's just, you know, different ideas, maybe perhaps vying for power, or if not vying for power, what seems most appropriate to you. That language, that ways of thinking becomes easier to accept in a post World War world. So that's the thinking stuff. And then on the impact to the church, at least, just after the world wars, that's where we see the mainline denominational booms, right? We get the massive explosion of churches in America, especially
yeah,
with Baptists and Methodists, so on and so forth.
yeah.
And then this kind of national sentiment of, I guess I could use the word American exceptionalism, becomes a little bit more prevalent. The idea that, America has entered into this war, and then, we've come out the other side, we're the victors. And it's not hard to attach that to God's providence over this country. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower, I believe it was Dwight Eisenhower, is the one who puts, in God we trust. Wait, no, it was in the
Cold War. It's a Cold War thing. Yeah.
Pledge of Allegiance, yeah. So, so mentally, it was easy, which is odd. This is how history is. It's like on the one side, it's like it's never been easier to doubt that there was any God at all, but on the other side, it never was easier to be like, no, God's on our side. So it's very much kind of two different rails that we're holding on to, and I describe it. I use this object. I just need to get through this. Sorry. If you've ever been on an escalator at a mall, and if you've ever tried to keep your foot on the ground and then let the other foot kind of ride up the stairs, if you ever seen Elf, you'll know when he does that. A kid, it begins to kind of pull you apart, and at some point, one of those legs is going to win. It's either going to be the leg that holds you onto the first floor, you're going to start riding up the escalator. It's going to be awkward, but you in the last, you know, 200 years of the time frames we're talking about here, America and the world, Christians are beginning to experience that sensation internally, where they're trying to
Mm,
keep one foot in old world understanding, but then a whole new world is emerging around them. And so they feel compelled to plant their foot into this new world because of all the promises and all this stuff. And that continues even after the world wars. And that creates tension in the minds and the souls of people. They have to find a way to reconcile these things that we still hold to be true, but a world in which it doesn't seem like they could be true. So that's very philosophical. But for me, that's kind of the frame within which we paint these pictures that we look at now, right? So you
yeah.
mentioned new atheism, you mentioned seeker sensitive, the non denominational boom. That could not have happened had
Right.
these events, post World War events and the changes in the ways that we think, and changes in the church's exponential explosion, and then the way we tie that somehow to American exceptionalism, which is where we get the rise of the moral majority, and Falwell and Pat Robertson and all that. So you're right. There's a lot of different branches we can spread off here, but that would be kind of the teeing it up. And from here, we
The
can go
responsible
in
tee up. Yeah.
myriad directions. Yeah. Thank you for that time.
Yeah. No, you're good. Aaron, how do you sit with all of that? Because I mean, half of this has occurred in our lifetime, and the other half of it is stuff where we've asked, "Hey, mom and dad, why is the world the way it is?" And they point to the 20 years prior to us being alive. So really, this history that we're covering today is our context plus a little more. Like we could talk to somebody who lives through the context we're trying to get to. Like, how do you sit with all of this?
I think I think that just kind of bore a lot of militant church behavior
Hmm.
because we had a lot of, militant fathers who were part of the wars and, generations from there didn't know how to process emotions, didn't welcome emotional intelligence as much, which is why we kind of see this generation kind of vying for it a lot,
Yeah.
because our previous generation didn't really get to enjoy or experience that. You know, yeah, I mean, you hear it all the time. Parents growing up from strict churches and stuff, and that still exists today. Not to say it's bad or good or anything, but I don't know. I think that's just kind of it's not even just the church, it's kind of affected the environment and atmosphere of many homes where people just kind of grew up in a more, you know, I would say an emotionally absent environment. People weren't really taught to do that or embrace it, and it was just more militant. I don't know if that makes sense on what I'm talking about, but
No, I think there's part of it that makes sense. There's another part of it where I'm kind of like, okay, Aaron, we're gonna have to probably follow back up with you to unpack that. But
yeah,
but but my quick response to Zach's point, postmodernism was not something I had thought of, but when you really look at, I love that topic in particular because I just think it's so interesting. And I've written papers on it and other stuff. So I've put a couple of neurons to the cause of figuring out what the hell postmodernism is. But bringing that up as like another main through line. And another thing I think of is kind of going in between the two world wars. Do you remember German expressionism as like an art movement and stuff like that? How like the anguish of the German people after being declared the losers of World War One, they just sort of lost their minds a little bit. And then that really set the stage for Hitler and for someone else to kind of bring some sort of clarity and all this other stuff. I think collectively speaking, what we've watched is kind of the world slowly lose its mind, but not like as fast and not as pronounced as like German expressionism, where it was like a flash in the pan there and it was remedied. I feel like in the wake of the Second World War, what postmodernism has offered is a philosophical kind of slowly setting down of the line between good and evil and the line between truth and lies and the line between sanity and truthfully a little bit of insanity. And that's just coming from the secular perspective. But I also think that that also comes in with the backdrop of, and I'm just thinking about this on the fly as I'm just sort of saying this, but something in my gut says that doesn't just manifest in a spiritual and intellectual sense, but that also manifests in a physical sense. So, for instance, the hollowing out of the urban core from a lot of families to move to the suburbs, and then the burgeoning of the suburbs in the late 50s and kind of having that quintessential kind of 1950s decade, the Eisenhower years, where you have a house, the white picket fence, like you could paint the American dream and everybody pretty much had it, or a lot of people did at least. And by extension, you see this new phenomena of churches, to bring this back to the church, these mega churches that already existed in urban cores like downtown areas by nature of being in higher density areas with more people. Now you're seeing that phenomena go out into the suburbs, not only because there's a sizable population there, but also the majority of the money is there from the post-war boom to kind of get out of the crazy of the city. And so I think it would be interesting to start at least in that phenomena and then to kind of sort of creep along the rest of the historical path. Because I think you don't get the Calvary Chapel movement without first seeing, big church movements going into the suburbs. What that trend predicates, like, the Calvary Chapel movement in the 60s and that becoming its own denomination and blowing up. And then people in evaluation of that, just to kind of give like an overview of it, kind of business practice in church, mega churches becoming something that seemed really cool and profitable. And then the seeker sensitive movement as a kind of a key point strategy that brings us from really the 1980s, like the early 80s and the Reagan years, all the way through to 2019. And so I think let's just start there. Like, what do you guys think about this idea of like just us, like just the whole point of Like, you have this grief of the wars, and in the midst of that grief, you have a lot of men moving their families into the suburbs to kind of have like a quieter, simpler life. How does that change the dynamic of church? Going from this like, well, really, this is I think how it changes it, but like how does it change the church as it goes from a neighborhood centered thing that's dictated by population density in proximity, like somewhere you could walk to, as opposed to somewhere you could drive to? Does that make sense? What are like some of the other things that come along with those side effects in your minds?
Well, jumping in here to save you, only because not because I don't think you have anything to say, but because it's like, okay, that's a big question. So let me yammer on this for a while, and then
Go for it.
you can come in with the right answer.
No, you could just come in with the distilled point to make, as he
Yeah,
always does.
yeah.
Mm.
I mean, it's a pretty broad question, and it can be answered in a lot of different ways. Depends on who you ask, right? You
Right.
could ask the
Postmodernism.
question of a myriad number of disciplines and get an interesting facet. I would say, among other things, you're kind of already drawing our attention to the fact that there's a phenomenon that happens when people are moving away from their families of origin,
Hmm.
right? So
Didn't think
think
about
about
that.
now we have entire generations that are now beginning their, family story in another place than where they grew up, which kind of in a way is the story of America, sure. Sure, but in the wake of everything we're talking about here, there was reasons that people might choose to do that. Not the least of which was the GI Bill, giving people a house basically, and then wanting to start that family and having a little bit of pocket change because hey, nothing is better for an economy than war. So you have those things happening at the familial level. Then you bring all those people and you put them into an urban center, as you've rightly put it. So now those same religious impulses, those same religious itches have to be scratched. The thing is that we don't have that church on the corner like we had before. Now we begin just immediately, it's like, what's the church that's already there? So people are now going to start driving to this church. And so the concept then of this is the small community church that I go to, and it's, within like a couple square miles, now all of a sudden you get a bigger set of people, bigger sets of concerns,
Hmm.
different opinions. People are coming from different places. You got people moving from the Northeast. You got people moving from the Southeast. And there could not be bigger differences in worldviews sometimes when it comes to that fact.
Yeah.
So you've got the financial aspect, got a lot of money. You got a lot of that money coming in through tithes. And so the churches can, expand and it's like everything's booming, right? But then you also have to find a way to like have these people see themselves as a family unit, which I'm not even sure they even would articulate it that way, because that's stating a problem that we see through the rearview mirror. For them, it's like the crisis. It's a good crisis to have. We don't have enough chairs, to put these
Hmm.
people in, right? So
Yeah.
now the church has to deal with like table making problems on top
Hmm.
of other other things that they could deal with. So, among other things, we've got churches that are exploding in growth, and with a lot of people come the natural challenges when you just get a lot of people in the same room. Getting people into the room may not be as hard as getting everybody on the same page, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So there's just one aspect. I'm sure there's others we could look at.
Mm.
I mean, there is something to be said, Aaron, about the whole community piece. Like, church goes from the thing you used to walk to the thing
Yeah.
you got to drive to. I mean, to me, that almost sounds like the earmarks or the foreshadowing for the consumerism conversation we had a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Like, that sets the stage for that.
If I may, Aaron, could I ask you a question? This is kind of
Sure.
weird to do cross pollination like this, but it's just something that I wrote down when you were talking earlier and making your points, and I think this might be an appropriate place to bring that up, but shoot it down if I'm wrong. Okay, so all of us, have spiritual parents, spiritual grandparents, I would assume, right?
Hmm.
We have, beliefs that kind of go back before us. And so thinking about the fact that now we are entering into the conversation where the line of the conversation is moving up into our parents and grandparents world, right? They obviously grew up with a certain set of experiences which informed their faith, and also the way in which they practiced their faith and the way they prioritized it and certain things that they did or didn't do.
Yeah.
Are there some things that you have seen in yourself or in your generation, it sounds so old when I say it, um, that you feel like those things have been either reprioritized or abandoned altogether? Things that were important to your grandparents, but now aren't so much important maybe to the grandchildren. Have you
Yeah.
ever experienced that?
Yeah, I think so. When I first called that out, sometimes often do, is it always sounds kind of like a negative connotation, but I don't mention the positive side. I guess to answer your question, what I've seen is we've gone from, there's also this understanding that we've gone from like a concrete belief system because it had a more militant, attachment to it, to now more of an abstract, I would say almost, you know, I wouldn't say unstable, but just kind of like almost a lack of just foundational understanding in a lot of things because there's almost
Mm.
too much influence. It's almost like, not to say that every belief was correct, but it's like at least they believed in something. At least there was some sort of yes or no. I'm going to stand by what I stand by because this is what I'm fighting for. This is what I believe in. This is the set of rules that I've been taught. And because of that, I can get behind it, I can operate in it, and I know what to do with it. And so now we get into this day and age now where, we're kind of, I wouldn't say we're past the information age, but we're definitely in an age of information. It's been around for a little bit now. And now we have the ability to question everything. And it's almost like, and that could be a good thing. I do believe in questioning everything and trying to, conclude your own answer. And I guess that's why I mentioned that earlier, is because of that, it's like I don't just have to go by the rules that I've been taught. I actually can think for myself. And maybe there is some, like when it's going back to the emotions, there's emotions that I've been burying because I've been told X, Y, and Z about them or not been encouraged to express them. But I actually have a lot of questions about them. And so I feel like it's kind of this two-sided thing, going back to what our grandparents grew up with. I think what has been lost, or not really lost, but what has attenuated quite a bit is just, standing on a concrete belief that you don't really feel you have to question, which can give you a sense of foundation, can give you a sense of stability, and that's actually an important thing to have as well.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, among other things, here is that when you use the term militant here, it's identifying what's worth fighting for. There was perhaps a more, I think you used the word concrete way of establishing this is right, that's wrong,
Yeah.
and nary the twain shall meet, and this is where we will,
Yeah.
launch the bombs.
Yeah.
These are the battle lines that have been drawn and probably
Yeah.
were drawn by their parents and grandparents, so it's like it's
Yeah.
tracking with that. Whereas now
Yeah.
that's perhaps one of the things that has been lost, or I love to like the word attenuated. It's just been
Yeah.
It's a great word.
Yeah. And I it's also kind of like, having a concrete set of rules is actually a good thing. Not to say military was a game, but when you think about a game, when you play a board game with friends, if there's no rules and people keep adding their own rules, there's just kind of chaos. Sometimes it's not fun anymore. It's just like, well, if we're not going to follow the rules, like this game doesn't even make sense anymore. Screw this game,
It's
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
but it's the difference between Monopoly, Uno, Risk, and
Yeah.
Trouble and Sorry, And so we all, I think, just to those points there, I think going on the game board and the board game metaphor, I think fits a little bit. I'm a big board game fan. I guess that just makes me a gamer in general because you both know I'm a big
Nice.
Switch guy as well. Something that stood out to me, Aaron, if I could just jump in on that, is I
Oh yeah.
think conviction is an easy thing to give a participation trophy to in the midst of postmodernism.
Yeah.
Because postmodernism, the mantra is there is no truth, so be open to anything. So if you're actually standing any ground on anything, that's a pretty, to kind of go into a meme voice, I don't know the comedian's name, but that's a pretty strong stance to take, you know? And so that, I think, is just the point I kind of wanted to be like, hey, like conviction is kind of a rare thing in today's world. It's very easy to be passive in the name of tolerance
Yeah.
and in the name of being empathetic.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've been reminded recently that even to some extent, being tolerant and empathetic is not the same as being loving and compassionate.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, you know, being empathetic and tolerant is the splenda for the honey that Christ calls us to give to the world, which
Yeah.
is that love and compassion. And that doesn't always mean, um, you know, to say, oh, you're right, and oh, I'm wrong, or maybe there's another thing of that. It's to say, I want to know how you think about
Yeah.
this. Would you be willing to hear my side? If not, okay, I'm good to just be a listener here. But it's about giving the love and compassion that's needed in that moment and, you know, not forcing anything, but still maybe even being a little bit persistent to say, I have something I'd like to give you if you want it. And, you
Yeah.
know, and just waiting for their own curiosity to eat them alive a little bit, to put it grimly. Uh,
Hmm.
and so those are a couple of things that that came to mind as far as conviction and, you know, empathy and intolerance and stuff like that. But I also think one thing that was in style that then fell out of style that I am watching come back into style is confessional theology.
Hmm.
Zach, you know what I'm talking about when I say that, don't you?
You may have to define that.
You don't know that?
Sure, there's a lot of things I don't know.
But your archetype is supposed to be the brain trust here.
Look, you put that label on me, son.
That
I
was that
didn't
was
do
on
that.
me. That's on me then. But
So help our
okay.
listeners understand what you mean by confessional theology.
So so if you guys know like the Methodists, Catholics, or even confessional Luther, like traditional Lutherans are confessional. But growing up in a Lutheran, I didn't grow up Lutheran. I grew up in a Lutheran high school. So like some of my formative years were there were a lot of jokes made about Lutherans. One of which, and this kind of helps highlight the point, is how many Lutherans does it take to change a light bulb? None. They're using candles. And we say the same for the Catholics and the Methodists, and to some extent. But confessional theology is one of those things where, you know, if you, it's, it is a good one, isn't it? We do have to laugh and to make fun of confessional theologians, but basically what you find out is, you know, infant baptism is kind of the precursor to this, but you go through infant baptism and then you go through confirmation. And when you go through confirmation, you learn the confession of faith. And that confession of faith is unquestioned. It's kind of like you're going line item by line item about what you believe.
Hmm.
You figure that sucker out and you essentially sign the dotted line saying ditto for life,
Mhm.
so that you have good standing within the church and within the community and with other folk. And Orange, California, where I went to high school, is a very Lutheran place. Like Anaheim, Placentia, that whole north end of Orange County, inland Orange County, very, very traditional. You would not know it if you just said the OC and Laguna Beach and Huntington and Costa Mesa, you know,
Yeah.
the TV show and things like that. But you go into the really rich areas and it's steeped in tradition. And you wouldn't know that unless you were there. But confessional theology essentially says this is what we believe, and we're not going to question it. We're just going to kind of refresh ourselves on the facts even deeper and learn how to articulate those facts well. And it's very militant, to use Aaron's word. And I'll say this, I had many a friend that, well, we all had questions. We weren't Lutheran. We church hopped. We went to the non-denominational church. We wanted to ask them being the theology teachers, and this is me kind of venting just a tad 10 years later. What do you mean by that? Back that up. We have questions, things like that. And what they would say is, it is what it is. That would be their answer to all of that. And so I think we've gone from a culture that's been largely confessional to largely discussional and philosophical. And now people are kind of done talking and they want to kind of codify things again. And so we're going back to what I'm calling the new, the new confessional.
Yeah.
The new confessionalism in the church. And that kind of gets maybe into what I would call 2027, 2028 kind of stuff. That's some stuff we'll talk about next time. But I think what you're talking about, Aaron, just to put, I think for some of our more nerdy listeners, confessional theology. This entire idea that you sign ditto on the dotted line during a confirmation class after infant baptism, and that's that. And so
I could see that a
yeah,
lot, honestly,
no,
because I mean, you could feel it. Like people are tired of just like theory. They want real accountable action behind words now. They're kind of being tired of being lied to or just what ifs. They actually want to see accountable action applied to all these thoughts and ideas into reality, whatever that may look like, even outside of the church. People just want something real, something tangible, and I think that makes sense, which is why I think it is beautiful to see that, because you do need something concrete to stand on. You can't just,
yeah.
stand on nothing. You do need some sense of foundation in order to move forward in life. I think it's funny when people tell me like there are no absolutes. And then my
That is an
response is,
absolute.
yeah, my response is, are you absolutely sure?
Uh-huh.
Because exactly what you just said. You are stating an absolute when you say that, which means you believe on something. But yeah, I definitely feel that. I definitely feel that energy around people's desire to like, they're just tired of thinking and musing about all of it. They actually want to see something into action now, which taking all your abstract thoughts and putting it into a concrete belief.
No, for sure. It's just, I don't know, like, I think most of this episode should probably be a little bit more about like discussing how we got from like a confessional theology to not, and
Yeah.
kind of the effects of postmodernism and,
Yeah.
consumerism and, just sort of maybe drawing that line. But I think to put more old school language, and I can't believe I'm the old school guy being like, oh, I have the old word just sitting there like on the tip of my tongue. But that's what most people would say. And there's a lot of, I will say this as to where we are right now, and then we'll kind of go back into like the 80s. We'll go back to the past real fast. But a lot of resentment was made from confessional theologians and confessional ministries, so like Lutherans, Methodists, Catholics, because there was no room for discussion. And so the backlash that we see kind of going through, the late 70s, the early 60s, that 20-year period kind of leading into the Reagan years, truthfully, is this giant backlash to people who, to an institution that wasn't willing to talk
Uh-huh.
or to entertain other things. It's like, the church through the last 90 years has had to do something it never wanted to do. It had to grow up a little bit. And it had to stop saying, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, and had to say, well, God had an idea for that. And so what does proliferation of the species and the biological imperative say about God? Like we have deeper conversations. So it's not to say we aren't going to end up at the same answers we had 100 years ago. But I think when people come back around the block and say, hey, like, I have a question about why we believe that, you're going to have ministers that are going to be ready to say, and I'm willing to buy you as many cups of coffee to sit with you through your questions as you need so that I can hear you and so that you can hear me. That's what has taken 100 years, in my view, for the church to learn. And I think we don't get, and we're kind of doing this kind of out of order, I think, today in this podcast, whatever, but I don't think we get to where we are right now, where there's such a renewed interest in the church without going through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 10s, the way that they did. So those 60 years or so, like we don't get anywhere we are right now without those 60 years being as tough as they were on the institution itself and confessional theologians. Because, I mean, truthfully, it's like if the only thing that came out of all of that were just the John Mark Comer books, truthfully, I would be game for that. But so much more, Tim Keller, you have, so many people that just modeled what it was like to have a conversation in a difficult circumstance as a Christian.
Yeah.
And that has been what's dominated the conversation. Like that's why Tim Keller and John Mark Comer and so many of these, what I would call like the West Coast evangelicals and even the Calvary Chapel movement, which might be a great segue into that real fast. But like that all had to do with talking to people that no one in the institution wanted to talk to.
Mm.
So we don't get to where we're at now without this entire, like conversationalism movement or moment, as we might call it in long-term history.
Yeah.
But this, this new confessionalism isn't coming around by accident. It's coming as a kind of as a gift back to the church to have this ability to assert and to lean on some certainty after it's learned how to actually love people, not as like pastors to people, but also institutions to the culture as well. That's my theory on it. Anyway,
It makes sense, history just interconnects with each other, and it's kind of a never-ending waterfall,
Yeah.
And so you can't really get there without things happening. So it makes sense.
Yeah. But anyway, confessional theology, that whole thing, there's big tension there. Most people, I would even say, like that come from more traditional circles or not, you're not mad at the institution. You're mad at how confessional the institution is.
Yeah.
That's what you're mad at. So anyway, we'll end on that point and we'll probably come back around to it a little bit later. But let's go to Calvary Chapel here real quick, because a lot of, I would say, the megachurch movement of what we know now is in part because of this accidental move of God that was essentially a ripple effect of the Azusa Street revival in Southern California. Chuck Smith, Lori Frisbee, and really the welcoming in of hippies into a traditional church setting in Santa Ana, Costa Mesa, California. There was a recent film called Jesus Movement with Jonathan Rumi and bunch of other Christian folk, and it kind of details the story of Chuck Smith and Lori Frisbee and Greg Laurie and all those folk as they're kind of navigating that movement. But it's stuck with us today, and I think at least a lot of the non-denominationalism I've grown up in was heavily influenced by that or some ripple effect thereof. Zach, what do you think is like maybe the biggest impact of like Calvary Chapel on like what we're looking at today, beyond the fact that it's its own institution, it's its own denomination? Our old church, well, still your church, but technically is Calvary Chapel. The pastor that founded, I won't say the church, but where we met was out of Calvary Chapel, somewhere in, I forget exactly, but
California
you know,
somewhere.
somewhere in California. So like our friendship is to some extent a byproduct or a ripple of that, which is weird to think.
Well, I think the thing that I could say about Calvary Chapel is that my wife and I were not looking for a Calvary Chapel church. And I think that's
Mm.
perhaps one of the more telling things. When we were looking for a church home together, and even that phraseology is, modern parlance,
I was thinking the same thing.
right? Because it's like church home. What the heck are you talking about?
Judah Smith, anyone? Anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So we went to places, and it was like dating churches. It was terrible. not you, it's me. God opens the door, he closes the window. That kind of
My
thing.
goodness.
So but we
Perfect.
didn't have to go too far, fortunately, in terms of time before we find ourselves, you know, at this church, and we were drawn. We were not drawn for doctrinal reasons. Shame to say. And that isn't to say that they were, on shaky doctrinal ground. It wasn't that. It was not a doctrinal like, well, did they line up with the P's and Q's and all that other stuff. Um, we found ourselves in an environment that, at the time was very, things were done very much orderly. And that has more to do with the administration of that particular church. We understand later that Calvary Chapel model is not so much a centralized organization of churches, but more or less kind of like a federation of churches. There's a lot of power that is granted to the local congregation. They aren't having to like appeal to Chuck Smith for every kind of decision and things like that. So for us in particular, us landing at Calvary Chapel had there were a lot of reasons that fortunately as we began to dig in and ask the doctrinal questions and like figure out, well, where exactly are we landing on stuff, we found ourselves very much in harmony with that. And we were able to put our roots down. Calvary Chapel is a model, as I just mentioned, it is there are other, I suppose, denominations or movements that had this kind of structure, which is to say, not really heavily structured at all. And I think that's maybe the one of the biggest contributions that churches like Calvary Chapel introduce or reintroduce rather into the American marketplace. And that is, you don't have the heavy-handed, you don't have that confessional like as you're using it. You don't have a pope, you don't have a bishop, of a conference somewhere, kind of peering down their nose and saying like, okay, now we really got to get in line with, we're trying to, do some fundraising for this ministry project across all of our churches. So we all need to be preaching the same message. We need to be, you didn't get that kind of synchronicity. Um,
Yeah.
there seemed to be a lot of freedom for that local congregation to move and in response to what was happening within the local body and what was happening in the world at large and helping us kind of reconcile what all that stuff out there was happening and what it meant inside here. That was the gift of Calvary Chapel
Yeah.
when Rachel and I
Mm.
settled in that. I hope that that's a helpful.
No, that's wonderful. I have a cousin who's a Calvary Chapel pastor, and long story short, it's just a really great expression of church, I think, and I love that it's been able to go on as long as it has, and the impact it continues to have in the broader, not even just American conversation, but globally. Half of their congregations are international, so half of it's here, half of it's everywhere else. So I think that's kind of interesting. The the other thing I can just say this is, well, Calvary Chapel churches are they're pro education. So like they have like Bible schools and stuff like that, like little, whatever. They're very entrepreneurial. So long as you have the drive in you to start one, they make it fairly easy. But the other thing that's kind of interesting is that when you make it that easy, then the question of, hey, like, how are we filtering the good eggs from the bad ones? And so then you can get a lot of strong-headed people in there because they're enterprising entrepreneurial folk that are educated, that you educated. And so now you have that whole getting on the same page thing being a problem, which is kind of what we talk about. And so, I mean, like out of Calvary Chapel came the Vineyard movement to some extent, which then was kind of, if we wanted to use a lot of the language we've used this season, which was a semi-restorationist movement for Calvary Chapel that wanted to get back to the Azusa Street roots. But when that split happened, they actually merged with the original church from Azusa Street, and that's how that all became what it is, which I think is, in an odd way, a great story. And I think both sides handled that really, really well. It was like, there's no beef. We're going to let you go if you want to. And then there's that. And so I think one of the big issues, and this is a great segue actually, but one of the big issues that we see in the church, like from, after the Calvary Chapel movement, some of those initial divisions there, in the conversational movement of church and non-denominationalism as a whole, is I think this entire idea of these entrepreneurial, enterprising pastors. And from there, we get two things. And this kind of brings us into like the 80s. You get the seeker sensitive movement, because now churches have proliferated. The Jesus movement is a thing. It's not uncool to be a Christian. It's kind of the cultural norm again. And you get mega churches. So you get Willow Creek, Crystal Cathedral, you get Mariners Church, you get Saddleback Church, you get insert mega church here, you get business practices coming into the church in mass as a way of managing this on the piggyback of the suburbanization and this post-traumatic stress disorder, postmodernism that we've seen just consume the culture. Almost like we kind of wandered into this blindly is kind of how it feels as I'm talking about it. But let's talk about seeker sensitive movement. Aaron, what do you think about like I mean, you call it cafe church, but like, isn't there a point to like trying to be, sensitive to the newcomer? Like if you're trying to grow the faith, isn't there something to be said about like trying to do that in a winsome way to the outsider? In a conversational, winsome way to some extent? One second.
I think it's definitely needed, because I guess when I think about Christ and how he operated, like he brought people down to their level, or he brought
Mhm.
himself down to the people's levels, what I meant to say. Like he didn't
Yeah.
just, like he even kneeled before people. He wasn't kneeling before them like they were king, but he was humbling himself before them to say, like, I'm here to show love to you. Like he wasn't bowing down to them, but he was like, let me wash your feet. Like, let me be there for you, because it's one of my favorite principles is servant leadership, because that's exactly what he's commissioned all of us to do. Is like, you're no greater than the other person. You're here to serve them, you know? Just, which sounds crazy to say, but he's like, just as I served you all these years, I need you to do the same for others.
Yeah.
I was reading Ezekiel 16 about it, and the first part of it is just how God is just like, I actually wept reading it, because it's just God is just saying, like, look what I've done. I've given you kingdoms, I've given you lands, I've given you wealth, I've given you embroiderment, I've given you all these things, and it's still this like, what more do you want? Like, I've done all
Mm.
this for you, serving you, which is weird to say that he's served man, you know?
Feels a
um,
little wrong. Yeah.
it does, but it's out of love. And so I bring that up because I think churches that model that is also important, because we do need to show an environment, and encourage an environment of welcome, and you can come as you are, because that's exactly how God embodies it. And that's not something that's wrong. Churches from aforetime that enforced strict dress codes, or you can't, you have to operate in a certain manner, that's actually not of Christ, because he actually doesn't say that.
Right.
And that probably hit some tones for some people, but it's true. Like, don't get mad at me. Like, just look at how Christ operates and how he shows up for people, meeting them at their level. And
Mm.
so I think
Well done.
when they're trying to embody an environment of sensitivity, I think that's beautiful, because we should all be sensitive to people around us in general, whether you go to a church or not, you know,
Right.
in the workplace, your family, your friends, you know, uh, people are complex creatures, and you need to, I wouldn't say you need to, but, um, you should encourage yourself to try to just continually practice to be aware, because you don't know what type of people you're going to be interfacing with each day. And you're not going to be perfect at it. Because at the end of the day, wouldn't you want someone to show that same love to you? Yeah.
Mm.
Wouldn't you want someone to show that same sensitivity to you? You know? You're like, this seems
Yeah.
like a scary environment, and all I need is just someone to show me that it's going to be safe, and I can
Yeah.
come in um, as I am.
Yeah.
Because for all they know, I could have grown up in an environment of rejection, and that's the last thing I need right now. I
Yeah.
need to be accepted.
Yeah. I think a lot of what you're saying, just to I think ground it in some of the language we've been using tonight, goes back to that entire idea of conversationalism. It's not to say you're wrong, but it's to say you're welcome and you may not have everything you need to be right, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
right.
And so I also think that that comes with, Zach, to your point, like postmodernism, like we don't get to this like necessity for posture without the culture taking this nosedive into this lack of truth posture. Like we don't like the church is forced to go and meet the culture and to try and thread this needle between love and tolerance. And we wouldn't have wanted to do that unless the culture took the nosedive first, if that makes sense. And so to get out of this confessional posture to go into this more conversational posture, I feel like postmodernism to some extent has been a gift to the church in that regard, to especially to what Aaron's saying, which is to say, look, I don't need to be, I may have been in a rejected environment my whole life, and I just am looking for one place to belong, you know? And I don't think we get there without the trauma and, even some of the, I guess, some of the wrong turns culture has made, because it invites the church, I think, if the church is the main character of the story to some extent, the people of God are the, not to, we're not going to get to dispensationalist, anti-dispensationalist conversation tonight. That's a whole other bag of beans, and I don't want to talk about it right now because that's a tougher needle to thread. But I'll say this: if the people of God, however they express themselves, if we're grafted into the Jewish story or not, are the main characters of the story, then other subplot elements of reality focus to drive that narrative of the character development forward, is what I believe, truthfully.
Mhm.
Like God doesn't allow the plot to thicken unintentionally. And so if we have these two wars and we get to postmodernism and then we get to the Calvary Chapel movement and the seeker sensitive movement, and now what we're calling conversational instead of confessional, theological application, like we can call postmodernism a very backwards gift to the church in an odd way. It became kind of the new villain, but it also forced us to equip ourselves in ways to love people better,
Yeah,
which is in response to it. It's not to say
yeah,
that we embrace it, but it's to say that in confronting it, we've become better Christians
yeah.
to some extent. And so, no, Aaron, I think what you said was excellent. I just kind of wanted to rephrase that just to say, hey, I think if we could put what you just said in this language, I think that would. Did I misinterpret anything? Did I miss anything of what you said?
I don't think so.
Okay. And I think there's even just something to be said very quickly about like Calvary Chapel. Again, credit to Calvary Chapel and to what the Lord did there. But a lot of what made that work was by welcoming people nobody wanted to welcome.
Yeah. Mhm.
Like the entire idea of like, we're going to have hippies in like a conservative church with pews. We're going to let them bring their blankets in and sit and relish in the word of God.
Yeah.
We're going to let them come in barefoot, not properly dressed. And we may need to call the janitor to do a double scrub after, but we'd rather they be here than shooting up on the street, you
Exactly.
know?
Exactly. You just hit that tone pretty hard there. Yeah.
But the other thing is this too. It's like it's the same sentiment of hospitality that comes with being friends with somebody.
Yeah.
Like Aaron, I know you have a great place. I know you're comfy, but I'd rather you'd be here with me and just hanging out. Or I'd go over there with you. Zach, the same goes for you. It's like I know you got a great setup and you're married and it's a great gig and you got life and whatever. Like you got, a good situation. But I'd rather be in the same room as you. Like, this would be so much more fun if we all could be in the same room. I think we would all agree on that. And so it's that kind of like posture of hospitality where you have no regard for how the sheep look. You just have a regard for, I love having a big flock. Well, not even just having a big flock, but just like, I like having sheep in my flock. Just it's like, and Lord, if I have one sheep, I'm fine with that. But if I have 150, I'm also fine with that. And just welcoming people in. Like I honestly believe that it would, well, I'm not sure if I believe this or not, but I could make the bold assertion that I would not be surprised if the next major move of the Lord comes through celibate LGBTQ.
Yeah.
And these people that are figuring out there's more to life than just sex, truthfully. And people being like, man, it's just like I was in that lifestyle. I've done things that you would have said fire and brimstone for, and now I'm not. Like, I would not be surprised if that's the next major, or maybe even the last move of the Lord, to bring revival, is going to be from these people that we currently are fighting over that we don't know how to deal with. Because the last time we did that, it was over the hippies. So, I mean, that's my little prediction there, but conversational Christianity and Calvary Chapel, seeker sensitive movement, I think there's a good thing there. But I think if I could go onto the dark side of this, and Zach, I want you to respond to this part, but unless you want to respond to the light side of it first. You want to go to the dark side? You want to let me entertain your cynic real quick.
Darkness, let's go.
I am darkness.
Gonna
Are you okay? Oh, that's hilarious. Oh, I had a guitar just like that. Did you buy it? Did you buy my old guitar? That looks exactly like the one I used to have. That's insane. What are you doing?
You're going to the dark side. I was going to do a soundtrack.
You're going to do the soundtrack. But no, so here's my thought. So seeker sensitive movement and seeker sensitive posturing is an incredibly popular, what I would call broad-based business model for acquisition.
I'm sorry, is that a question or is that a
So I was
Yes, I agree that is something that you said.
Yes. So would you agree with me that the seeker sensitive movement, when it comes from a posture of, I love sheep in my flock, is a beautiful thing? But on the dark side of it, where it's like, I like having big coffers and big buildings and big churches and being famous and having a platform, that then becomes something that is very quickly perverted into feeding the ego of a speaker or somebody who wants to be famous.
Well, let's understand that those things that you just mentioned, which are the negative pieces, those aren't part and parcel to seeker sensitive. We can find
Correct.
those in, any number of denominational, any
Correct.
expression of Christianity that has human beings involved is going to contend with those impulses, that desire to just say the thing that would accommodate or say the thing that would enlarge your territory or increase your brand or however you want to look at it. My dad and I would have conversations about this. And he instilled in me in several ways the idea that when one is called to the pastorate, in ways great and small, that is a call to come and die. As we all are
Yep.
called to come and die, but that is a particular death of ego because you have to serve sheep that will just as easily turn into wolves and consume you as well. So the temptation is always there to create something that is a Frankenstein. I think that was a term you'd used a few episodes back, and I really appreciated that one, Asher. Frankenstein, to take this resurrected body of Christ and then join it through some kind of surgery to something that has nothing to do with Jesus Christ, and that usually is like a piece of our ego hanging off. It's a terrible image. So that is a negative aspect of church and any institution that has to deal with hierarchy and organization and then all that's people stuff. Okay, the thing about seeker sensitivity that concerns me is the degree to which seeker sensitivity stays in seeker sensitivity, right? If we might use the object, that seeker sensitivity is a little bit like going to where the people are, so that they might come to be interested in the things of God and the things of Christ.
Yeah.
Then the seeker sensitive person who's entered into that or has invited them in should also be doing that uncomfortable work of helping that person at some point, maybe a day, it may be, I can't say that for certain, but at some point, the question of cost counting has to come into play. Counting the
Yeah.
cost of what it is to become a disciple of Christ.
Yeah.
Because at the that's where I see seeker sensitivity like fall into the ditch. It gets a
Yeah.
bad rap
Mhm.
for that. I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, seeker sensitive," they're just going to stay, you know, suckling at the teat of seeker sensitivity for the rest of their lives, and they're never going to grow up. They got to eat some meat. And
That's
yeah,
true.
they do. So seeker sensitivity is great so long as it is not the destination, right?
I agree.
And that
Yeah.
people are finding reasons and coming to understand better who Jesus is, who they are, right? And then, the difference between the two and what that might entail. Because anything less than what Jesus Christ is up to, which is, the death of self, just all that stuff. If we just make this thing about us and what makes us feel good, it's not hard to create anything that makes us feel good and then slap a cross on it and then say, well, that's a church or that's
Mhm.
a move of God, right? Well, I don't know. There's other criteria that we need to. And so here I come in like an accountant, with my clipboard and my little pen and go like, well, let's see where you guys are, doctrinally. So Trinity, where are you on that? And then, some heresy comes out of their mouth and you're like, oh, well, I thought as much, you seeker sensitives. Who was your teacher? Let me pull it. That I think is the larger problem.
Yeah.
Egotism and self-branding, self-authenticating, that's been time immemorial. Didn't need seeker
Yeah.
sensitives for that. But helping people grow into mature faith, I think that's the challenge with seeker
Yeah.
sensitivity.
Yeah, and I think seeker sensitive movement, we could briefly say a couple side effects include abandoning doctrine for numbers
Yep. That's so true.
and abandoning doctrine for relevance.
Yep.
And it's not to say that it's not a good drug to take, but I think if you're taking it and you don't have the symptoms of a church that needs to take it, then you may need to take the other pill, which is called confessionalism, and that's just called getting sober.
That's a funny way to put it, honestly.
Like truthfully, it's like if you're seeker sensitive, if you're a confessional church that doesn't like standing up for its beliefs or having a conversation about it, take the bitter pill and learn how to articulate lovingly what you believe. But if you love just lovingly and just making sure people have their place, but there's no theology behind it that says Christ is Lord and you're doing something wrong and some repentance needs to happen, because the
Yes.
the value proposition of
hmm
church is that you need to be changed,
hmm
is that you need to be transformed into the likeness of Christ from the likeness of yourself. If you're not selling that, if you're not selling life transformation, you're selling a social club.
Yeah.
And you need to get off of the proverbial seeker sensitive pill and sober up for a little bit, have a glass of holy water, talk to a Catholic, and find your way somewhere into the middle, quite
Yeah.
truthfully. And I mean, that's a very brash way of putting it. And it's not to say that Catholics are extremists. No, it's just they're very traditional, very confessional. They've,
hmm
it's like the last time they changed a comma in everything, Martin Luther had an issue with it, or the schism or whatever, like the filioque. Like they don't change much. They really haven't. So, take a nice cold sip of water and become a little bit more confessional. Like figure out what you believe. And then when you do that, then you're going to be like, okay, like all the other churches will be like, that's heresy, or that's close. Maybe that's worth the conversation. People will finally be able to engage with you, and you'll be able to engage with the rest of the church. People won't be able to be like, they won't just write you off saying that you're just some crazy church that's trying to, make God gay, so to speak. So that's one way to put it. But that's seeker sensitivity. I think it's pretty safe to say that the 80s and 90s were probably the best 20 years for humanity. And I'm not saying that as a 90s kid. I'm saying that as somebody who's looked at history and looked at human flourishing. You look at the end of the Cold War, really, and the proliferation of culture. We're kind of before we get to all of this technological yib yab of where we're at today, but we have enough time away from the world wars. The Cold War has ended. You have, if you want to throw Reaganomics in there, my Republican mother will be proud that I even mentioned it. You have just a lot of things that are going well in the world in the 80s and 90s. You have the boom and busts, sure, but the Cold War ends and you look at the 90s, and a lot of people actually say that the 90s were like the best 10 years to be a human, all things considered. In 2001, 9/11 happens. And with that, you have a visceral reaction to that event. And you have people returning to the faith in huge droves. Christianity, nationalism, all of that saw a huge spike in the weeks and days after that event. You also saw this beginning of the new atheism, which in many ways I think is dying out pretty quick in this moment that we're recording in. But Zach, could you give us a quick overview of how you would define the new atheism and some of its impact on like the last 20 to 30 years,
Well, uh,
or really the last 20
shooting from
years since
shooting
2000? Yeah,
from the hip here. Shooting
do
from the
it.
hip. Well, new atheism is atheism. The only thing
Right.
new about it is the way in which it's discussed.
Right.
And there's certain, in much the same way we might say that there's, in when it comes to the Bible, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. That's our Gospels. New atheism might be like, the Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris.
Correct.
There's like the four horsemen of the new atheism.
Yep.
And here, this atheism is not so much on the defensive against Christian beliefs, implied, explicit, otherwise. But now we find a different tone in the way that the atheism is expressed. It is now
Mm-hmm.
seeking to go on the offensive. It's seeking to take ground for atheism. It's no longer content to just kind of be an also ran or an option or somehow continue to tolerate these religious expressions, not just Christianity, right? Judaism, Islam, things like that. Um, new atheism, among other things, is that very militant. Now, this is a different use of the word, but militant. It's going after specifically these these core Christian beliefs and assumptions, some of which were held by our grandparents, some of which are just steeped in our culture, and it's seeking to kind of draw those out, expose them for the foolishness that they are, and in place of that, put the whatever that might be, the secular humanism or something else. It really, to me, it's not that new atheism is new. It's just new in the way that it's the methodology of atheism. That may be very surface level, but that's what makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think, Aaron, do you have any thoughts on this? I have a quick little thumbtack thought on it.
No, no comment on it.
My thumbtack thing on new atheism is just that it. You said it right, Zach. I think the only other thing that's interesting is that in the conversation of faith in America, one thing I've appreciated about new atheists is the quality of the questions that they've presented in the last 20 years or so.
That's true.
I think that's helped us in this conversational Christianity and postmodernism do the hard work of articulation ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, in Christianity, there are no enemies. There are people that give us a hard time, but there are really no enemies. If you really respond to Christ in a loving way, the only enemy there is the enemy, and
Right.
those legions of demons, and that's it. Everyone else is a long lost cousin that just doesn't know it yet.
Yeah.
That's waiting to be adopted.
Right.
So
Exactly.
um, in one of the letters Peter wrote, he basically says that the people outside the church have a hand in shaping it as well. That this is an all hands on deck thing, whether everyone knows what hands their deck is on, what deck the hands are on, so to speak.
What verse
And
is that?
so I think it's somewhere in Second Peter, if I'm not mistaken. I forget exactly, but there is something of a note within one of the two letters that Peter wrote. I do know that, where it basically says that outsiders have somewhat of a role to play. And so I'm pretty sure you can quote me on it being from the Peters. I don't know which one, but all that to say, on New Atheism, they helped us ask better questions, have deeper conversations, and I think it helped us get to the point where, we didn't want to articulate our stance on abortion, but we had to, and we did. We didn't want to articulate our stance on X, Y, and Z, but we had to, and we did. And I think one of the side effects of confessional churches, or churches that should have been conversational, being maybe a little bit too confessional in a conversational when it required them to be conversational, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
and church hurt.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to sum this up. I'm going to be really reductionist right here. But I think church hurt comes from confessional churches being too confessional when they should have been conversational.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I think you could sum it up like that. I think that's 80% of church hurt. Now, you have abuse survivors, you have emotional abuse, you have physical abuse, you have the horrible things. But I think 80% of what you can talk about is you have somebody that wanted to talk through some stuff, and you have a pastor that just knew his textbook a little bit too well and forgot how to be human for a little bit. And
Yeah.
that's that. And I think so much of the deconstruction movement, which I think is a symptom of the new atheism entering into the chat the way it did, asking as good questions as it did, is actually is a byproduct of churches that refuse to be conversational when they should have been.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so then you have these people that are going to go out and do what Aaron has said is such an incredible thing in postmodernism. Go out and find the answers for yourself. Go out
Yeah.
and find, you know, your own theology, because the people that had the keys to the theology aren't really going to share them with you.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to go and scale the wall yourself, and it feels kind of lonely.
Yeah.
If anyone feels that way, there's another podcast called Voxology by Mike Erie, was a pastor of mine. He's kind of made it his life's mission to reach those folk. The
Yeah.
deconstructing kind of just deep thinker. He's politically moderate. I would even say slightly left of center, but he is such a thoughtful person. He's here in Tennessee as well, but he's such a thoughtful person. And his wife was actually my math teacher at one point. So there's a fun fact. But lovely family, great people. But if you're looking for conversations to, and a voice that really loves speaking in a conversational way to people that have been hurt by confessional posturing, he's your guy. Mike's your guy. So there's that. But I think a majority of that, so we've gone from seeker sensitive, new atheism. I think megachurch is, you could say that that's symptom of suburbing and, perhaps egotistical greed in part to some extent. I want to go back, Zach, to your one point that said, like, to be a pastor is a call to die, is a call, like, is ego death, like the ultimate ego death.
Mm.
I think sometime, I'm just going to say this, in the late 90s, like from 1995 to 2015, I think you have like a 20-year period there where you have a lot of people that were riding the coattails of like being the next Rick Warren, being the next John MacArthur, being the next Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll may have even been one of those folk. You know what I'm saying? So you have a lot of people that I don't think saw the call as ego death. I think they saw it as a way to get the white picket fence, to get their GI Bill.
Mm.
And that's a grave accusation. But I also
No,
think, and
no.
I'll wrap this one part up here. I also think based on just some of what I've seen and also just the proliferation of church scandal, even outside of the proliferation of information access, something of that has to be true in my opinion, to some extent. Because if it was really ego death, I don't think we would see as much, truthfully.
Did he get raptured?
Seriously.
Can't hear you.
Psych. Non-denominationalism was the correct answer. Anyway, so
Yeah.
has anyone seen that South Park episode where it's like Mormonism was the right answer? Like who got raptured, who goes to heaven? That was funny. Anyway, but do you get what I'm saying with the whole ego death and confessional thing and scandal? Kind of like trying to contextualize that piece of it too. Because I think that's a huge part of what's happened in the last at least 30 years, at least in my lifetime. Feels like if anyone was really popular, if they didn't do ego death in their calling, they got it while they were in the midst of their calling.
Well, let's be clear. Ego death, in the context I'm using it, it's an ongoing.
Right.
It's part of the pastor's job. It's in the job description.
Correct.
You know, and the examples that we could cite of, pastors behaving badly, shall we say, to me would be symptomatic of something that just hasn't quite died yet.
Hmm.
And therefore, it is being allowed to live where it should not and thrive where it should not.
Right.
Driscoll is the whipping boy because he had a whole podcast, talking about
Correct.
the horrible stuff that he did. But he also had the ability to communicate. So if we have to, as Christians, we have to hold to the hope that in addition to some doctrinal things,
Hmm.
his ability to communicate effectively the gospel of Jesus Christ to those who need to hear it, can still be accomplished. But there's some humbling that has to take place significantly, and he may not be able to do it with the people that would have listened to him before. But just to use him as an example, while I laud to some extent the expose mentality, shall we say, of podcasts recently, to be like, hey, look, we got bad pastors. I also have to say, okay, yeah, we also have some terrible Christians too. When are we gonna
Yeah,
start doing
we do.
podcasts on those suckers? And then really begin to sink our teeth into the realization of like, oh my gosh, if we're just gonna, just cut everybody's head off, so to speak, because we got a podcast about how they were horrible, who survives? Sorry, I'm getting a little diatribe there. And you didn't
No, you're
say
fine.
this. You didn't say that, Asher. I just wanted to just kind of throw
No,
that
you're
in
good.
as
No,
a subtext.
it's a good point. It's a good point. I think the funny thing about it all is like, and we've kind of come out of that a lot more with cancel culture to some extent. Like you have to do something horrible now to like really get like, I'll just be honest, like Michael Tate. Like you have to be like Michael Tate bad to like get canceled these days, which I think is both a good thing and kind of, like if you're getting there, like, ouch. But in cancel culture, it was one of those things a few years ago where it's like, oh yeah, your crucifixion's at noon, mine's at 2:00. Do you want to get brunch right beforehand? Like if you said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing. And I think, we could go down that rabbit hole really, really fast. But I think I want to end with this, just kind of looking at the time and trying to be mindful for all of us. How have those years set up this current kind of 5-year post-pandemic stint moment that we find ourselves in? Like, how has the whole mishmash of everything, and this feels a lot like throwing spaghetti at a wall this episode, but I think it's been kind of fun just to sort of be like, hey, there's this thing, hey, there's that thing, hey, there's this. But I want to hear from both of you. How has the 50 years before the pandemic set up where we are right now? I will say this. Can I be a little bit? Can I be a little bit? Can I be a little bit of a smartass? We've done a podcast on all of it, so we've had that conversation and we've broken it up into like 10 or 20 different pieces. If you could put it into like 50 years, I think is so much because it's the immediate context to our stories and our stories. You know, you know?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate it, but man, I mean, like, I can't answer that question in 5 minutes.
Well,
No.
It's a great question, but I cannot answer it in 5 minutes.
no,
I
for
got an
sure.
answer. I just can't do it.
We'll have it be the opener for our last
I
episode
was
then.
thinking you probably should say it for the next one, man.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Because you literally talk about the pandemic, and now that opens a
Right.
can of
And we're
worms.
gonna yeah. So we'll dovetail this here. I'm just gonna say this. A lot of the best and worst parts of the last 50 years really shone through into the pandemic. Like, I think the pandemic was this bright light that shone through the prism of all we think that the church is and can be. And it showed us everything that was beautiful about it, everything we loved, everything that was great, and everything that could be improved in like an instant. Um, but we would have not gotten that prism of anything without the last 50 years. We would not have this really great guess as to what the church can be and what it should be.
Yeah.
And without some of the gunk and the tension of what 1970 through 2020 was, which is to say, in America, it went from being this neighborhood phenomena to being this cultural phenomena. And part of that is because of the legs that megachurches like Willow Creek, Saddleback, Crystal Cathedral, and movements like Calvary Chapel and the seeker sensitive movement all combined in the wake of the war and post traumatic stress and postmodernism, all kind of, you know, to use this phrase again, Frankenstein together to create what we know today. And I think I've said this before and I'll say it one more time. I think the church has blindly gotten itself to the point where it's at least when we get to 2020. I think we were Frankensteining, kind of like picking up a body part here and throwing it on and doing all this other stuff and just having it all join the conversation.
Mhm.
And then the pandemic hit and we figured out which parts of the body were great, which parts weren't, and how to just reckon with all of it. And so we will open up our last episode with the question of how do you think the last 50 years sets up the last 5? And we're going to open with that. But gentlemen, it's isn't it weird to think that we've gone through what 2000 years of history minus 5 or so
Yeah,
up until
the
this
way that
point?
the way a skipping stone crosses a lake. Yes, but
Yeah,
2,000
that's a
years. Yeah.
great way to put it. It's I like that picture. I like that picture. It's so
That's a good
pretty.
way to put it.
Anyway, but no, and I think we've given a kind of a you have an intellectual, a thoughtful. You have 3 thoughtful people, and one of us has crippling ADHD, unfortunately.
No.
And so, but we've done it to this extent. With that, I'm just going to say this: in the search for unity, because I always like figuring this out just at the very end. If you are somebody that's looked at the church over the last 50 years and said this thing has really gotten off the rails or doesn't know where it's going, I think to say that it is Frankenstein its way to where it's at as a way of matching the vibe with the culture and trying to progress in a meaningful way, kind of in a lopsided fashion, you would be correct. I think that there's nothing wrong to say about that. But I also think the exciting part about where we are at right now is that that's no longer happening. And you should wait and listen to our next and final episode to figure out exactly what that is. So without further ado, signing off. We'll see you next week.
Take care.